Asking whether or not Julius Caesar was a good general sounds like a pretty stupid question. Because if you ask any historian, they'll basically tell you that the guy was a battlefield genius. Not only because he conquered all of Gaul, which on our map here is everything in black, which is not only all of modern day France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but also parts of Germany, Holland, and Switzerland. But on top of all of that, he also won an entire civil war. But here's the thing, none of those historians that have studied and written about Caesar have actually fought in tens of battles all over Europe or commanded tens of thousands of soldiers in a war. And so the point of this video is to ask, would you not be interested in a critique of Caesar from someone who has done all those things, from someone of the same sort of caliber? And I mean, to give you like a sporting analogy, if you're interested in basketball or watch the NBA or whatever, who would you rather listen to talk about Michael Jordan? Stephen A. Smith or LeBron James? In our case, the problem is that finding someone with a similar sort of resume to Julius Caesar and who's also written about him is not an easy thing to do. But someone who does fit that criteria is Napoleon Bonaparte. And in his book Napoleon the Great, Andrew Roberts writes that after the French emperor got his ass kicked at Waterloo and was exiled to St. Helena, the guy had a lot of free time on his hands. And with that free time, one of the things he did is he dictated his commentaries on Caesar's campaigns. And he called it Précis de guerre de Caesar. And I just so happen to have a translated copy of it with me right here. And so I thought, would it not be interesting to see what one great thought of another? And so what I'm going to do in this video is, in the first part, I'm going to look at Napoleon's analysis of Caesar's Gallic campaigns from 58 BC to 52 BC. And then the second part will go over the Civil War. Now, let me say right from the very start that Napoleon's commentaries are not what I thought they would be. And the first thing that surprised me is how little analysis there was. And I mean, so this entire thing right here, this entire book is like 100 pages, but most of it is Napoleon just summarizing what happened. So for example, in 58 BC, he'll go, this, and this happened. And then in 57 BC, Caesar did X, Y, Z or whatever. But Napoleon's actual breakdown on tactics and thoughts and his notes and all that, they're just like a couple of points for each year. So that was a little disappointing. What's nice about that for this video is that I won't need to actually recreate most battles in order to discuss his thoughts and comments. So that's the first thing. Very little analysis, very little tactical analysis. But the other thing that surprised me is that I thought Napoleon would be praising Caesar a lot more. I thought he'd be glazing him for all the clever little things he did and drawing comparisons and all that. But it's actually quite the opposite, where he's quite critical of Caesar. So for example, in 58 BC, Caesar fights two big battles. The first was versus a tribe known as the Helvetians, who lived in what is modern-day Switzerland. And supposedly the Romans fought 90,000 of them at this battle called the Bracht. And the second battle was versus a German king called Ariovistus, who crossed the Rhine with supposedly like 120,000 fighters. Now, at both of these battles, Caesar had 6 legions with him. And if we assume that all 6 were at full strength, which they rarely were on campaign, but if we make that assumption, then that means each legion had about 5,000 men, which multiplied by 6 gives us about 30,000 heavy infantry. On top of that, we've also got auxiliary units and cavalry, which means he might have had 40,000 units in total. Now, some basic math tells us that at both of these battles, the Romans, who by the way won both of them, were greatly outnumbered. But what's interesting is that Napoleon calls bullshit on this and says that the Romans probably had the bigger army both times. Now, it's not that surprising that Napoleon would say this, considering firstly that the Romans like to exaggerate the numbers of their enemies a lot, but a lot of peoples and civilizations have done that, including Napoleon himself. But secondly, and much more importantly, is that Napoleon's source for these numbers right here come from this book. And this is Julius Caesar's Gallic war commentaries. Translated, of course, but it's a collection of the 7 books that Caesar wrote during his lifetime whilst in Gaul. And by the way, he wrote another one on the Civil War, which I also have right here. And what's incredible about both of these is that they are Caesar's own words, his own account of the things he saw and the battles he was in and his experiences and all that. And it's crazy because there's nothing like it from anyone else in the ancient world. I mean, can you imagine if we had something like this for like Alexander the Great or Scipio or Genghis Khan? So these commentaries are amazing, but the problem is that because Caesar was a fucking genius who wasn't writing to give people a factual retelling of events, but who also used these books as a propaganda tool and as like a political tool to enhance his own image, many people, not just Napoleon, have expressed doubts about the things like the numbers of enemies that Caesar claims he fought. So that's the first thing. Now, there's also another interesting comment Napoleon makes for 58 BC, and it's a point that he'll repeat a lot, and that is that the Roman army was so much better than any of the ones they faced. And so actually, let me just read you what he says exactly here from my translated copy of his commentaries, translated by R.A. Maguire, by the way. So in chapter 1, page 6, Napoleon says this, quote, "The army of Ariovistus was no larger than that of Caesar. The number of Germans established in Franche-Comté was 120,000 men. But what a difference there must have been between armies formed as militias, consisting of all the men of a nation capable of bearing arms, and the Roman army, composed of line troops who were professional soldiers and mostly unmarried. The Helvetians and the Suebi here being the tribe of Ariovistus, were without doubt brave, but what can bravery achieve against an army disciplined and organized like the Roman army? Thus, there is nothing extraordinary about the success achieved by Caesar during this campaign. However, this does not diminish the glory which he deserves." End quote. And what Napoleon's talking about here is he's saying that these battles, these fights weren't fair. So, for example, consider that every legionnaire, every Roman legionnaire wore armor, whereas most tribal warriors didn't. That alone is going to make a huge difference in hand-to-hand combat. But the second thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is that every legionnaire also went through a lot of training, right? By practicing with their weapons, by practicing going on long marches, by practicing getting into formation. They just did all these things that none of the tribal armies did. Now, it's important to point out that some of these tribal armies might have had maybe like a small, rich, semi-professional corps that did practice and did wear armor and all that, but their numbers were so much smaller in comparison to the tens of thousands of legionnaires that Caesar had at his disposal. Now, on top of just the individual differences, you also had the group differences, right? When you organize the legionnaires into legions. And versus the tribal armies who fought in very loose formations with no real structure, what made the legion so powerful was their cohort system. And so to explain that, I've got with me here a fully decked Roman legion, 5,000 men. And by the era of the late Republic, around the turn of the 1st century BC, whether this was by a gradual change or not is up for debate, but basically the Romans began to divide their legions into 10 cohorts, with each of these containing 480 men. So here, for example, we've got one cohort with 480, another one right here, so on and so forth. Now in battle, these cohorts would then usually line up in a triple line formation, known as the triplex axis. Now, this wasn't a hard rule. The flexibility of this system is what made it so powerful. So sometimes the commanders could line up their cohorts in 4 lines or 2 lines, but usually what you'd have is 4 cohorts in the front like this, followed by another 3 behind them like this, and then you'd have another 3 behind those guys. And what made this system so unique was that compared to almost all the armies of the ancient world, the Romans had like a pocket of reserves stored in their second and third lines, which gave them a crazy amount of flexibility. So, for example, at this Battle of Bibracte in 58 BC versus the Helvetians, what happened was in the middle of the battle, thousands of Helvetian allies arrived on the Roman right and threatened their flank. But because of this triplex axis, right, because Caesar had access to these 2 extra additional lines, in order to prevent his right from collapsing, he ordered the third line here to peel off and form a new front to face this sudden threat. And so as a whole, because of the bullshit numbers, because of the difference in the quality between the armies, Napoleon's basically saying, yes, Caesar deserves glory for his first year, but it's nothing special. Now, the next year is no different, because again, Napoleon was quite critical, and to understand that criticism, let me very briefly explain what happened. So in 57 BC, Caesar fights this big confederation of tribes who come from this gray area on our map over here like this, which is basically most of modern-day Belgium, but also parts of Holland and northern France. And anyway, Caesar, who called the tribes living there the Belgae or the Belgic tribes, he says that in 57 BC, they combined their forces into like this huge army that is 300,000 men strong. So he goes north to fight them, but for a while no big battle takes place because neither side was willing to fight without significant advantage. But eventually what ends up happening is another great example of this difference in organization that Napoleon was talking about, although he doesn't point it out explicitly. But basically what ends up happening is that this big tribal army was not logistically sophisticated enough to support their soldiers with food for long periods of time. So once their supplies ran out, this huge army was forced to break up, with each tribe having to go back to their own town or village or whatever. And of course, as soon as they do this, Caesar starts picking them off one by one, executing the strategy of divide and conquer. And he does it so well that eventually there's only really one big tribe left willing to fight him, and it's a tribe called the Nervi. But when he moved north to neutralize them, he falls right into their trap. And this is what that trap looked like. So as Caesar was moving north, he and his armies come upon this river, which was followed by a clearing and then a forest. Now, a couple of interrogations had told him that there was an enemy army waiting for him on the other side, so he orders some cavalry and auxiliary units to go check things out, and they run into a couple of enemies, but it's nothing they can't handle by themselves. At the same time, the Romans decided to set up camp for the legions over here. Now keep in mind, Caesar got 8 legions now. He's added 2 new ones, the 13th and the 14th. But anyway, each of these legions then began to arrive to start construction on this camp. So first the 10th legion come marching up in column, and they lay down their helmets and their weapons and their shields and they get to work. And they're followed by the 9th legion, who show up and they start doing the same thing. And then you've got the 11th and they get to work too. And then you've got the 8th, and then you've got the 12th, and then come the 7th. But right after the 7th, instead of the 13th and the 14th legions, you instead had the baggage train, which is where all the army's food and supplies and spoils of war, it's where all that stuff was stored and sorted. And supposedly, right when this comes into view, the Nervi launch the ambush, where at the signal, thousands of men who had been waiting in the woods emerge suddenly, and they brush aside the cavalry and auxiliary that had been skirmishing, and they come running right at the Roman camp. This prompts Caesar and his officers to start trying to organize a defense, and they manage to somehow create a disorganized line. Now, when the two sides make contact, the legions in the middle and the left hold it together and begin to push back. But on the right side, things look bad because that's where the main enemy attack was focused. And so many Roman officers of the 12th and 7th Legion were killed, and their men were retreating. And Caesar tells us that because he had no more reserves to throw in, remember, this wasn't a set-piece battle, this was an ambush, right? He didn't have time to set up the triplex axes. He's forced to pick up a shield himself and walk to the front lines, where he tells us that he starts calling centurions by name and encouraging soldiers to stand and fight. And eventually he manages to reorganize the men there into a sort of a square or a circle formation to keep the flanks protected. And he stabilizes things long enough for the tide to turn, which began when the 13th and the 14th legions, who had been marching behind the baggage train, these guys had started to arrive. And also the Roman left, which had driven back the Nervi forces they had faced, instead of pursuing, they come back and they help mop things up. And that basically concludes what was known as the Battle of the Sambre. Now, when I first read about this battle, I thought Napoleon would praise Caesar, right? He'd praise him for managing to turn such a near-run disaster into a victory, and for rushing to the front of himself and realizing that he needed to keep morale up by showing himself and all that. And instead, his only comment on the battle is that Caesar never should have allowed himself to be ambushed in the first place, and that he should have sent his scouts to patrol the forest itself, and he should have placed armed men on the perimeter of the camp to protect those who were putting it together. So again, that's another example of what I'm talking about, where I'm surprised by how critical Napoleon was. Now, he does make another comment for 57 BC, but it's a more general one about the nature of Caesar's campaigns as a whole. And so let me read you again here what he says. This is from Napoleon's own words, his commentaries in chapter 2, page 11. He says this. He says, quote, "It is difficult to make purely military comments on a text which is so brief and on armies so different. How are we to compare a Roman army of the line, raised and selected from across Italy and the Roman provinces, with barbarian armies composed of mass levies, brave and ferocious, but with so little knowledge of war that they did not know how to construct a bridge, build rapid field fortifications, or erect a tower, and who were astonished to see towers approaching their ramparts?" End quote. And what Napoleon's talking about in that last part, by the way, about the tribal armies being astonished and all that, was how Caesar, who was conducting mopping up operations after the Battle of the Sambre against a few of the smaller tribes that had continued to resist, how some of these guys wouldn't surrender until the towers that the Romans had built came into view, and how as soon as they saw those things, they surrender immediately. They just say nope, there's no way. If you guys built that thing, there's no way we stand a chance. We're out. We're done. We surrender. And Napoleon is making a very similar point to 58 BC, where he's basically like, what do you want me to say here? This isn't a fair fight. And this difference in organizational and technological capabilities between the two sides was a realization that a lot of the other Gallic tribes had started to accept at the end of 57 BC as well. Because for the next 4 years, from 56 BC to 53 BC, there are no more real large pitched battles. For example, in 56 BC, there's only one large naval battle, but Napoleon doesn't say anything about the battle itself. His only comment was how, after defeating these people, Caesar was wrong to behead all the nobles and sell the entire population into slavery. In 55 and 54 BC, the Romans go to Britain, but from a military perspective, not a lot happened. The first time they go, Napoleon says that Caesar, who only took 2 legions with him, should have brought 2 more along, and that Caesar not managing to bring any cavalry speaks to an overall lack of preparation and that the whole thing was a waste. The second time Caesar crosses in 54, he does manage to take 5 legions this time, as well as a bunch of cavalry and auxiliary. But again, not much happens, and in the end he's forced to return without much money, slaves, or tribes that had submitted in any meaningful way, which again has Napoleon basically called the whole thing unimpressive. Also, in 55 and 53 BC, Caesar crosses the Rhine to fight a bunch of German tribes, but both times, none of them were willing to face him in open battle, which again has Napoleon critiquing Caesar for leaving no real presence and for failing to get the submission of his enemies. What's funny though is that despite writing like a combined 10 lines on these German excursions, Napoleon will write like pages and pages about the bridge that Caesar built to cross the Rhine, and he talks about how it wasn't that impressive and how if his own engineers were to build the bridge today, they'd do this and that differently. Just all this technical engineering jargon full of numbers and figures that really reminds you of how much of a nerd Napoleon was. Anyway, this relatively uneventful pace of events was shattered in 52 BC when most of the tribes in Gaul rebelled. And the guy who ends up leading the rebellion is called Vercingetorix. And this guy is very different from other Gallic leaders that Caesar had faced, because not only does he instill much more organization and discipline amongst his men, but he also starts using these advanced tactics, like implementing a scorched earth policy to deny the Romans supplies and executing a guerrilla-style warfare by way of like quick attacks and ambushes. But it's not enough, because Caesar ends up cornering him along with supposedly 80,000 of his men at this town called Alesia. Now, because this town was situated on a hill with steep slopes on 3 sides, Caesar knew he couldn't lead the direct assault on it. So he starts conducting a siege, which involved building what is called a circumvallation around the town, which is basically like a series of like ramparts and ditches and small forts, which encircled the town, and supposedly the whole thing stretched like 11 miles long. Now, right before Caesar could finish surrounding the place, Vercingetorix supposedly sent his cavalry out to raise an army, but because that would take weeks, in the meantime, Caesar has his men build a second defensive line, this time facing outwards, known as a contravallation. When the tribal relief force does finally arrive, according to Caesar, they numbered like 250,000 men and 8,000 cavalry, some stupidly big number like that. And to exert as much pressure as possible, this massive force launches 2 major attacks on the Roman defenses. And they try and do it in conjunction with those still trapped in Alesia, but the Romans manage to hold. Eventually, the Gauls come up with a plan to attack what they thought was a vulnerable spot in the Roman camp, so they put together 60,000 of their finest fighters to strike this place. At the same time, Vercingetorix launches an all-out assault from the inside, but Caesar and his officers again, they manage to hold, they rush reserves to the right places, preventing any breakthroughs, and a counterattack eventually crushes the tribal army, which forces Vercingetorix to surrender and ends the rebellion. Now, Napoleon's thoughts on this climactic final battle are interesting, because whilst he does spend an entire line praising Caesar and the Romans, basically saying, yes, well done on the fortifications, you deserve glory for defeating a combined Gallic army, but again, most of his analysis is him actually questioning what happened. So for example, just like in 58 BC, he again doubts the numbers given to us by Caesar, saying that Vercingetorix wouldn't have needed 80,000 men to play defense, and that just 20,000 would have been enough. And he thinks that if he really did have 80,000 men in the town initially, why didn't he send a lot of them out with the cavalry before the Romans finished completing their contravallation? Napoleon also thinks that the relief army, the one that was supposedly 250,000 men strong, didn't move and attack like one that was so much bigger than the Romans. And he again guesses that the two sides were probably more evenly matched. And Napoleon basically says, if this Gallic army was as large as Caesar claims, why did they collapse so soon after the failed final attack? And his analysis for 52 BC is a really nice reflection on his thoughts on Caesar's entire Gallic campaign, where, yes, he'll occasionally give the Romans their glory or whatever that means. But for most of it, my impression is that he's doubtful and unimpressed. And there's actually a really nice line that sums up Napoleon's thought on Caesar's time in Gaul. And it's when he says this, he says, quote, "If Caesar's glory depended solely on his conquest of Gaul, it would be in doubt." End quote. Now, if Napoleon was more impressed on Caesar's conduct during the Civil War, unfortunately, again, he really doesn't go into that much detail. Despite this, it's still helpful to break down his analysis into 3 parts, with part 1 focused on Rome. Now, I'm not going to discuss the failure of politics that led to the Civil War erupting, because it's complicated and has nothing to really do with understanding Napoleon's military analysis. But what I will say to keep things simple is that in early 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon of the 13th Legion and marched on Rome. His main opponent was this guy right here, Magnus Pompey, who was one of Rome's greatest generals and also the guy in charge of the faction that opposed Caesar. But by the time he finds out that Caesar's on the way, Pompey, who had only 2 legions with him, decided that Rome could not be defended and decided to flee. In his analysis, Napoleon called this a huge mistake, saying that Pompey's legions in Spain could have been recalled to join him in time, and that by failing to concentrate his scattered forces quickly, the confidence and morale of his men, which was often a crucial factor in a civil war, was at a low point. Now, in part 2 of the Civil War, which also took place in 49 BC, involved Caesar going over to Spain to crush Pompey's legions that were stationed there. Napoleon does praise him for his campaigns there, but it's not worth going into any detail on it because the guy's got like 2 lines of analysis on the entire thing. If you're interested though, the channel Historia Civilis, which I'm sure a bunch of you are familiar with, they've got a good video on this topic if you're interested, in the details and all that, in a campaign that was called the Ilerda campaign. But what I will say is that the fighting there was a lot more about clever positioning, where both the Caesarians and the Pompeians would focus on things like freedom of movement and supply chains and all that. And that makes sense because this time, Caesar's fighting other Roman generals who've got access to legionnaires who are wearing armor and who know how to construct a camp and all that. And so in the end, compared to his victories in Gaul, there wasn't like a big battle or siege to end things. He ends up winning there after he manages to encircle the Pompeians and cut off their access to water. In his 2 lines of analysis, Napoleon says that such a victory could have only come through sheer clever maneuvering. Now, the final part takes place the next year in 48 BC in Macedonia, and the key battle that Napoleon talks about takes place when Caesar, in an attempt to capture Pompey's main supply base in a town called Dyrrhachium, arrived and set up camp right over here, between the town of Dyrrhachium itself, which was over here, and Pompey's camp, which is over here and located on this nice hill by the sea. Now, Caesar's entire plan was to construct a line of fortifications like this to try and encircle Pompey. So in response to this, Pompey starts building his own line of forts facing Caesar's like this. And these things might look small on my whiteboard here, but these stretched for miles. And of course, during this time, both sides are skirmishing and raiding. And it's another great example of how different the fighting looks when Caesar's fighting another Roman army. Eventually, the Pompeians launch an attack in the south and manage to punch a massive hole in Caesar's line. And so Caesar, in an attempt to regain the initiative, launches his own attack, but it goes really badly, and Caesar is forced to retreat from Dyrrhachium. In his analysis, Napoleon says he doesn't understand Caesar's thinking at this battle at all, because you're not in Gaul anymore. Now you're fighting one of Rome's greatest generals, who can have his legionnaires build forts and towers just as well as you can. Except here, you're also trying to do that versus an enemy who occupies the central position, which means that Pompey's got far shorter, more direct routes to his men, which made it far easier and faster for him to move troops and supplies and orders. And on top of all of that, you're also trying to conduct a siege on someone who has open access to the sea, which means you're not going to be able to deny him access to supplies. But what's also interesting is that despite all of Napoleon's criticisms of Caesar's mistakes, he also calls out Pompey for failing to maintain momentum and allowing Caesar to get away after being in such a weak position. Caesar's retreat would lead to the Battle of Pharsalus, where despite being greatly outnumbered, Caesar still manages to crush Pompey's army and sends him fleeing to Egypt. But Napoleon doesn't talk about the tactics involved in this battle at all. which I know is a very anticlimactic way to end things. But this is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, where I said that the guy just doesn't go into that much detail. And this confused me for a long time, because I was like, why isn't he bringing up Caesar's clever use of the third line at Bibracte, or the fourth line at Pharsalus, or any of these things? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I don't think Napoleon's commentaries were written to give us a deep analytical breakdown on Caesar's wars and battles, but were more like a useful summary. I mean, imagine you're someone who's living in 19th century Europe who wanted to learn more about Caesar's campaigns. You don't have Wikipedia, you don't have the internet to access, so who better to give you an outline than Napoleon? Now, also, I have to say that I don't think there's much more analysis that Napoleon could have given us anyway. Not only because the sources that he had to work with were so brief and limited, but also because Caesar's tactical brilliance, his ability to adapt, to raise morale, to lead from the front, all these things were so obvious that I don't think that there's anything extra Napoleon would have felt he'd have to say. Or at least that's my opinion on things. I don't know if you guys have any different opinions or thoughts on this. If you do, just let me know in the comments. And look, if you guys wanted an answer to Napoleon's thoughts on Caesar as a general, firstly, I should add that there are actually 5 chapters of Napoleon's commentaries that I haven't covered. One of those chapters was on Caesar's campaigns in 51 and 50 BC, and another 4 chapters that cover the civil war after Pompey's death in Egypt, Illyria, Africa, and Spain. I didn't want to cover these chapters because Napoleon's source for those years come from Caesar's lieutenants, not from Caesar's own writing, not from Caesar's own words himself. Not that there's that much more insight that you can really get from those chapters, but that's still important to make a note of. And maybe in the future, I'll make a smaller video on some of those chapters later down the line. But on top of that, I'm pretty sure that Napoleon thought that Caesar was a good general. Because I don't think, no matter how bored he might have been at St. Helena, I don't think Napoleon would have taken the time to dictate all this if he didn't think Caesar's campaigns were worth discussing. On top of that, we know that Napoleon also instructed his own generals and marshals to study Caesar's battles and wars, which again, he wouldn't do something like that if he didn't think that Caesar was a great general. But if you guys have any thoughts on Caesar as a general, even if you're not Napoleon, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And finally, before I end the video, before I end things, there are a couple of books that I wanted to talk about, starting with the collection book, which for those of you who are watching one of my videos for the first time, or you're new to the channel or whatever, it's my fun way of like organizing and keeping track of the battles and the wars and the campaigns and the leaders that I talk about. So, for example, here's the collection page for Napoleon Bonaparte, stickers for Marengo and Austerlitz and Friedland. I've got another collection page right here for his marshals. This one right here is the page for the Prussians. You got Frederick the Great, Frederick II right here, who I did a video on last time. Changed his name and made a couple of changes based on your feedback. But what I needed your feedback this time for this video is, initially I wanted to make a page for the enemies of Rome, where I was going to add a sticker for Vercingetorix. And maybe I was thinking on that page I'd have like Boudica and Attila, maybe even Spartacus. Not Hannibal though, because I think Hannibal deserves his own page. But what I wanted your guys' help with was suggestions on who I should have on this page. Right now I've got Vercingetorix, Attila the Hun, Shapur II, Boudica, and Arminius. But I don't know. I feel like I might be missing a couple of people, a couple of names. Again, not Hannibal because he's getting like his own page, his own separate page. But if you can think of anyone that I'm missing, anyone who deserves to be on an Enemies of Rome page, let me know in the comments. Now onto the collection page for the greatest leaders of the Republic for today's video. Firstly, I should add that last time in my Scipio video, on my Battle of Ilipa video, a bunch of you made some solid recommendations on new names that I should add. So thanks to those people. And I went ahead and expanded the page based on those suggestions. If you've got any more suggestions, or maybe you think some names that don't deserve to be on here, let me know in the comments. Make your case in the comments. And so for today's video, we're adding Gaius Julius Caesar. And last time I asked you guys if you think he should be on the Republican side or the Empire side. A bunch of you made some good cases for the Empire, but most answers were the Republic, which I agree with, so I'm keeping him here. Now, the image I chose for this video, the image I chose for Caesar, was one which is called the Tusculum bust of Caesar. See this one right here? It's interesting because the guy who found this bust was actually Napoleon's relative. He was like the grandson of his younger brother or something like that. But initially, I was going to go with this much cooler image right here, right? This much more Chad image for Caesar. But I ended up choosing this one because this bust is the only surviving portrait of the guy, which may have been made during his lifetime, so while Caesar was alive. So in my mind, that makes it the more likely representation of what he actually looked like, and so it was the best choice as a sticker image. So we're gonna add Caesar now. There we go. That's Julius Caesar added to the collection page. Now, we've also got a couple of battles to add, right, on our page for triumphs of the Roman Republic. And I'm going to add 2 battles today, one for Alesia and one for Pharsalus, which I know doesn't seem right because I didn't talk in any real depth or detail about Alesia, and I didn't talk at all about Pharsalus. But I'm adding them anyway because, look, I already made a video on Pharsalus, and honestly, at the pace that I'm making these videos, it's going to take a while to make, focused videos on these 2 battles. So, for the Battle of Alesia, I chose this iconic painting right here of Caesar. I don't know if you can... This iconic painting right here, which some of you might have seen before. It's from a painting made by a guy called Lionel Royer. And it shows Vercingetorix surrendering at Caesar's feet. So we're going to add this one for Alesia. There we go. That's the Battle of Alesia added. And finally, for the Battle of Pharsalus, it was kind of hard to find an image for this battle. And ultimately, I ended up choosing this one right here, which shows Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Now, interestingly enough, this image here comes from an American writer, an American author actually, called Jacob Abbott. And this guy wrote a historical account of Caesar's life, and he used this image in his book. And so it's the one I ended up choosing for Pharsalus. I know it doesn't depict the battle directly, but, depicts Caesar crossing the Rubicon, which triggered the Civil War, which, ultimately led to the battles. There we go. That's the Battle of Pharsalus added, and that's the collection book done. Now, final thing I want to talk about in this video, I wanted to talk about a book, and it's this book right here, which is Adrian Goldsworthy's Caesar, which if you're interested in buying, I've got an affiliate link for it in the comments below. If you click that link and you buy the book, Bezos throws me a couple of dollars for my trouble. But aside from that, I think that it's such a good book if you're looking to learn more about Caesar. Firstly, because Goldsworthy knows his stuff. He's a professional historian. He's done his research. And you feel that because some of the history books that I read, I feel like they try to hype things too much. They try to bend the truth, create narratives which don't have a lot of historical evidence behind them, but they put them anyway because they feel the reader will enjoy reading about them. But with Goldsworthy, you can feel that he's giving you information that is based on actual solid historical evidence. And so he doesn't try to, lie or exaggerate to make things seem more exciting. On top of that, he's got a lot of great images and maps to show you like the battles and stuff. So hold on, let me show you. He's got like pictures here like this. He's also got, for example, like this is the Battle of the Sambre that I showed in the video. A lot of nice, look at this is a map of the tribes. It's got a lot of nice illustrations, which I always like history books when they do that. I'm a visual learner, so that's great. I should say though that it's not a military book, but instead it's one that focuses on Caesar's life as a whole. But considering how much the guy fought, it means that Goldsworthy does talk a lot about the battles and campaigns anyway. And I suggest you check it out because in this video, I was focusing a lot more on Napoleon's comments on Caesar, as opposed to really going in depth on all the little tactical details of Caesar's battles and campaigns, which means I had to leave a lot of stuff out, a lot of interesting things, just because Napoleon didn't comment on them. So check it out. And yeah, that's really it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, if you can like and subscribe, I really do appreciate it when you do that. And if you've got any feedback for me, I also appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next video.